A person trying to write a book on the history of America without God is utter fabricated nonsense. There is no history of America without God. Here's what Mr. Seidel says. Read something other than your Bible. Life is too good to waste on bad ideas. Your book is a bad idea. It's not factual. And in fact, it's nonsense.
This is Pastor Greg Locke losing his mind over a book he hasn't even read. A book he's so scared of that he has to burn it for fear of the ideas contained inside. So I thought, how can I not reach out to the author to see how we got here and what this is all about? My guest today is a constitutional lawyer and is the director of strategic response for the Freedom from Religion Foundation, fighting every day in the legal trenches to keep church and state separate, because you can't have freedom of religion without freedom from religion. He finished magna cum laude from Tulane University Law School, is a brilliant public speaker, and has proven to be a meticulously thorough author as well, championing reason and truth with his first book, The Founding Myth: Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. Without any further ado, I give you Andrew Seidel. So the other day I was scrolling through Twitter and I came across this guy named Pastor Greg Locke, who was having a book burning of your book. Do you want to tell a little bit about the backstory to that? Why he was burning your book? How did it lead into that? Just how does a pastor wind up burning the book of a constitutional lawyer?
Well, I mean, a pastor burning a book can't be that uncommon an occurrence. But this actually started a couple months ago. I was watching a Democratic debate, and they showed this commercial for a movie where rich people were hunting poor people.
Hunting human beings for sport.
Twitter exploded when this movie preview was shown during the Democratic debate. Really ignited this massive conversation. Everybody was talking about the commercial, not talking about the debate for a little bit. And I found that part really interesting. So I got together with our FFRF team and I said, I think we ought to consider trying to run a commercial on a debate. Let's look into it. We tried to run our Ron Reagan commercial on ABC.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist, and I'm alarmed by the intrusions of religion into our secular government.
And ABC said, no, that's too controversial. We can't do that. We said, well, how about this JFK commercial that we have? It's this, JFK saying, I believe in the separation of state and church. That's absolute. They said, no, we're not going to run that either. Well, okay, fine. So we waited for the next debate. CNN asked them. They said, yeah, you can run your Ron Reagan ad. So we ran it, and it did what we were hoping. It went off like a bomb on Twitter. It was Ron Reagan was the most searched term on all of Google during that time. And, people were talking about the ad instead of the debate, which is exactly what we wanted. We wanted to change the conversation, raise awareness about FFRF and the work that we're doing. But because Ron Reagan said the word atheist, I'm an atheist and I'm not afraid of burning in hell.
Please support the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
It pissed off a lot of believers out there, including a lot of religious leaders like this guy, Greg Locke out of Tennessee. I think he's out of Mount Juliet, Tennessee.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation ran an ad during the Democratic debate that sparked a lot of controversy.
And he kind of started shooting his mouth off on Twitter, and I engaged with him a little bit.
I said something about it, and of course, they shot back, as well as one of their head attorneys, a man by the name of Andrew Seidel.
And then somebody else said, hey, Locke, you really need to read Andrew's book because some of the stuff you're saying is not accurate. And I jokingly said, oh, well, maybe I'll send him a copy. And I don't remember what he said back, something snide that made no sense.
It's not Freedom from Religion Foundation because atheism is not only a religion, it's one of the fastest growing religions in the world. They believe in religion just as much, if not more, than I do. Because it takes more faith for them to believe in the beginning dirt and nothing than it does for me to believe in the beginning God.
It was ridiculous. And so I was responding and I was kind of, I was doing what you do on Twitter and to people who have ridiculous propositions. Thomas Jefferson said that ridicule is the only weapon which can be used against unintelligible propositions. And Locke is kind of a man of unintelligible propositions. And the next morning I was sitting at work talking with people about the ad, and I thought, I am going to send this guy a copy of the book. So I wrote an inscription in the front, and it was heartfelt. It was genuine. What I wrote was genuine. There was a little bit of snark in there. I'm not immune from a little bit of snark, Thomas. I must admit.
What exactly does a little bit of snark look like for you?
Mr. Locke, there is still time to better your life. Even homophobic bigots and wife beaters can change. Let go of your hatred and fear. There is no God, and that's okay. This is not a Christian nation, and that's a good thing. Be better. Read something other than your Bible. Life is too good to waste on bad ideas.
It was a little cheeky. Basically, I was a little cheeky. I was imitating some of the Bibles that I had been given that had inscriptions in the front of them. So, I was trying to strike this tone. And I was doing it with a little bit of cheek, but also trying to kind of put myself in this pastor's shoes. These are the things that I'd received. Maybe if I strike that tone, it'll work on him and he'll actually crack it and read it. I can tell you for sure that based on his video, there was a couple things he said in the video that made it absolutely clear that he had not read the book at all. I mean, he reads the inscription that I wrote out loud, but that's it. You can tell he didn't get really beyond that in the slightest. I mean, he basically sets up these arguments as if I'm trying to make them. For instance,
in this book on the myth of the founding fathers not being Christian whatsoever,
to argue that the founding fathers were all not Christians, which is not an argument I make. In fact, in the book I say, look, the religion of the founding fathers doesn't matter, and we secular Americans, we atheist Americans, we ought to stop engaging on that issue. And I try to give new arguments for us in this Christian nation debate in my book, and he's talking about all the old arguments. So it's very, very clear that he did not read word one of the book. So he took a blowtorch to the book that I spent 8 years writing and torched it in about 20 seconds.
Which wound up actually backfiring quite a bit. I was reading through the comment section on underneath the video, and it was almost exclusively critical. It's like, how fragile does your position have to be to where, you're so afraid of the other argument that you have to try to burn it or put it out or hide from it. It's the equivalent of him sticking his fingers in his ears and going, nee, 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 nee. And, people were drawing comparisons to, Fahrenheit 451, to George Orwell's 1984, trying to censor ideas. There were people posting videos of, Nazi Germany, having book burnings and stuff, throwing books on the fire. And I saw this taking off I posted it to Reddit, and it started getting some ground there under r/atheism. And I saw people were posting pictures that they went out and they bought a copy of the book just because, oh, hey, if Greg Locke is burning a copy of it, it must be a really good book. So I think that
it ends up being a pretty good endorsement. I haven't looked at any of the numbers yet, so I don't know, how well it did really. But it is really interesting that it has the exact opposite of the intended effect. I mean, you can burn books, but you can't kill the ideas in those books. And Locke said in the post above the video, I don't remember whether it was on Twitter or on Facebook, he said, I struck back hard at these atheists. So he thinks he's being this, this strong, tough guy. And really all he's saying is, I don't have the intellectual fortitude or wherewithal to engage on the ideas. So I am just going to stick my fingers in my ear. I'm just going to burn the book, which has no effect other than to draw now attention to it, and more people are going to be presented with these ideas who are apparently more open to them than Greg Locke is. So, now that's not the way that book burnings always work. Some of the ones that you mentioned, in 1933, when the Nazis had that massive book burning across the country, I think they burned something like 25,000 volumes. I mean, that obviously was a precursor to something far, far worse. And luckily, we're not in that position in the United States right now yet. It's certainly not the same to say that one crazy religious nut is out there burning your book than this organized, massive, orchestrated book burning. Though we know that can happen. I mean, when Salman Rushdie wrote the Satanic Verses, that was burned in England. I think there were 3 or 4 different massive book burnings in England, right next to London, if not in London proper. And I think he was burned in effigy even in London. So, I mean, so, it could happen, but this just had the opposite of the intended effect. And instead of suppressing the ideas, they're now spreading far and wide.
It's like the Streisand effect, where someone says, oh, hey, don't think about a blue elephant. You're going to think about a blue elephant. If someone tells you, don't spread this idea, don't share it, don't think about it, you're instantly going to, go out and think about it, share it, and spread it. It has the opposite effect.
Yep.
There's in the Master and the Margarita, there's this phrase in Russian, rukopisy не горят. It's manuscripts don't burn, or they can't burn. You can't suppress an idea with fire. If traditionally during the Soviet Union, there was a tremendous amount of censorship of intellectuals and their ideas and their books and stuff. But this notion that you can just destroy the book and destroy the idea is extremely naive. Because, people would share ideas. Even when they would go to the gulags, they'd share the ideas with the other prisoners. They'd get out, they'd share the ideas. They had an underground printing press network. They would memorize their manuscripts, their books and stuff in order to not have it be confiscated and destroyed. But I wanted to touch on some of the ideas within your book, because you're not calling for an elimination of people's rights to practice Christianity. You're not calling for a ban on religion.
No, not at all.
You're simply pointing out the historical scenarios that led up to the founding of our nation, the positions that our founding fathers had at the time, and as well as why the values in the Bible themselves are contrary to the values of America. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. First of all, at the beginning of your book, you point out how oftentimes Christians will refer to our Judeo-Christian values. Why do you think that they incorporate the word Judeo when it becomes pretty clear that they're not very inclusive to Jews? They're not very inclusive to anyone but Christians.
Yeah, I mean, that's just, Judeo-Christian is a sop. It's a fig leaf. It is meant to make this exclusionary movement, Christian nationalism, it's meant to blunt the force of that exclusion, right? It's meant to make it seem less exclusionary than it really is. So they add this word in, Judeo-Christian, to make it seem less threatening than it truly is. And really you can date that phrase, Judeo-Christian, back to pretty much right after World War II. I mean, it had existed before that, but it really started to gain prominence after World War II, when having an exclusively Christian movement had these really ominous overtones because of the Holocaust and Nazi Germany. I mean, and the rise in the use of that phrase can pretty much date back to then. And I think there's a tiny other element that I didn't really get into in the book, where there's also the modern day support of Israel, as I think has a little bit of that flavor is thrown into the Judeo-Christian. But really, it's just meant to try to make it seem more palatable to the country at large and more inclusive than it truly is.
So especially during the time of the Nazis, one of the things that people often forget is that the first treaty that Hitler's Germany had was with the Vatican.
Yeah.
And that, over half of the SS were Catholic, professing Catholics. They had God with us on the Nazi belts. They had, it was all throughout Hitler's Germany was this notion that they were a Christian nation. And anti-Semitism had, whether it was through, all of the anti-Jewish pogroms and the riots and stuff all throughout, Russia and Eastern Europe, whether it was, the anti-Semitism in the Lutheran Church that was propagated by Martin Luther. But these anti-Jewish sentiments were very, very strong within the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church. So I can completely see how this change towards, we want to be more inclusive they still want to push back against the Soviet Union and say we're a Christian nation, they're a godless nation, but now they're just kind of pulling Jews under the umbrella as well.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't think they want to be more inclusive. I think they want to sound more inclusive, right? I mean, and I kind of break this down in the beginning of the book. I sort of show some examples where the other side accidentally gave the game away and forgot that they needed to sound inclusive. But yeah, I mean, I get into this on kind of, I think on pages 2 and 3 of the book. It's one of the first things I really dive into right away. Because, so the overall question that I'm asking in the book is a new one, I think. It's a question that hasn't really been examined before. I ask, did Judeo-Christian principles positively influence the founding of the United States of America? And the reason that that question hasn't been examined is because Judeo-Christian principles is this very nebulous, hard to define claim. So instead, everybody focuses on, well, are we a Christian nation? And that's kind of the question that most people have asked and most people have answered. But if you get at that underlying question, did Judeo-Christian principles positively influence the founding of the United States of America? You necessarily answer whether or not we're a Christian nation. And it's a much better question for our side, for secular Americans, for non-religious Americans, for atheists and agnostics to engage on. It's a much better battleground for us to be fighting on, rather than the Christian nation notion, which I think most people can probably refute.
Yeah. And I like how you divide it into you have, are we culturally Christian? Were we founded on Christian values? Were the founding fathers Christian themselves? Because those are all separate questions. And you could say right now, you could point to, things that are like on our currency or that are on our, in our Pledge of Allegiance and stuff and say, see, it's Christian. We say, one nation under God, but that wasn't there originally. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't a part of the intentions of the founding fathers.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and there's a number of different things that people will do to dodge the question about whether or not we're founded as a Christian nation, whether or not we're based on Judeo-Christian principles. And one of the things they'll do is, after you engage with them, they'll say, oh, yeah, no, I just meant like a lot of people were Christian back when the country was founded. That's what I really meant, which is not what they ever meant, and that's not an interesting observation, and it doesn't do anything to discuss or inform the political, ideological, constitutional, legal, governmental identity that we have as a country. So that it's an uninteresting observation. The same thing really for whether or not our nation is culturally Christian or whether we've had some cultural influence. I mean, certainly, you can point to various aspects of our language, for instance, that trace back to the Bible. But, it's not, that again is not really an interesting question because it doesn't say anything about the principles that informed the design of our laws and the design of our government. And so to really get at that question, I broke the book up into kind of 4 different parts. Part 1 looks at the Declaration of Independence, the religion and the beliefs of the Founding Fathers, which I essentially argue is not important, and our colonial history. Part 2 looks at the principles in the Bible and compares them to our founding principles. Part 3 is the 10 Commandments, walking through each one of those and comparing them to our founding principles. And then part 4 is what you just mentioned, which is what I call argument by idiom, American verbiage. And it's these Johnny-come-lately mottos, in God we trust, one nation under God, so help me God, God bless America, that kind of stuff. And the interesting thing about those, well, let me back up for one more thing and just say, the whole goal of the founding myth is to give our side better arguments. So right now, facts are not enough to win this argument. If facts were enough to win an argument in this day and age, Donald Trump wouldn't be president. So we've got to have better arguments on our side. I think probably a lot of the people watching this have cited, for instance, the Treaty of Tripoli to say, look, see, we're not a Christian nation. That citation has been around for decades and has done nothing to move the needle in our favor. We need better arguments to go with our facts. So when I get to the things like so help me God and one nation under God and stuff, yeah, I point out those are not from the founding era. They're much later additions. But it's even more interesting if you look at how they were added to the American vernacular, right? Where did these mottos come from? And in each case, you have Christian nationalists deliberately imposing these phrases on the nation at a time when it was under severe stress and strife. I mean, during the Civil War in one case, during the Red Scare in another, and for God bless America during what was up to the time the worst presidential scandal in history. I mean, so these are deliberately imposed on a nation by Christian nationalists, and they're often wiping out these earlier unifying sentiments, things like e pluribus unum, or one nation indivisible, literally being divided with God. So, it's not just recycling these old facts that people know, it's giving you better arguments to engage on these issues. That was the goal of founding myth.
I want to talk a little bit about the Declaration of Independence, because that seems to be one of the big sticking arguments with Christian nationalism, where they'll point to that and they'll say, look, see, they mention God 4 times. How would you address something like that?
Yeah, so in the book I have 2 chapters on the Declaration of Independence, and those 4 different references, I walk through every one of them, both for the content, and I talk about where they were at, when they were added in the editing process. For instance, Thomas Jefferson only included one of those mentions in his original draft. But again, when you're talking about better arguments, the better argument is not to get into the weeds on those. Your better argument is the Declaration of Independence is an anti-biblical document. The principles in the Declaration are fundamentally opposed to the principles in the Bible. I mean, there are 2 basic truths that the Declaration of Independence lays out. And first is that power comes from the people, right? And that's embodied again in our Constitution right there in the first 3 words, we the people. So Declaration says power comes from the people. And second, the Declaration says that people have the right, not just a right, but a duty to rebel against a government when it becomes tyrannical. So those 2 ideas, power comes from the people, rebellion is a right and a duty, are actually fundamentally opposed by the Bible. I mean, the book of Romans, chapter 13, says that the governments on earth are instituted by God. To rebel against them is to rebel against God, and you can expect to face the sword if you do so. Romans 13 has been used by governments for millennia. To justify all manner of atrocities. And in fact, it's still being used to this day by our government. The child separation policy at the border, the Trump administration has justified with Romans 13. So they are using these Christian nationalist talking points and these Christian nationalist myths to justify these truly evil Christian nationalist policies. But getting back to your question, sorry, deviated there. I'll get off my soapbox. The central argument we ought to be making about the Declaration is Declaration is this wonderful document, but it's anti-biblical. And if you want to talk about it as a founding document, it's a little off the mark. I mean, the Declaration of Independence was 1776. Our Constitution was written 11 years later. The Constitutional Convention was held in 1787. That's a pretty big space in between. And really all the Declaration of Independence did was severed our political connection with Great Britain. But it did lay out some philosophy, and there are a lot of reputable scholars who do argue that it is the birth certificate of the United States of America, let's say.
During the Continental Congress, oftentimes people will point to the fact that they were opened with a prayer.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite stories, and that ties into this notion that you're pointing out, that the Bible is anti-American in a way. Like the things that the Bible sets up as values are very contrary. And the example that you give is there's a guy who was appointed as the chaplain, and what people don't know is, one, he was not unanimously appointed as the chaplain. There were actually 2 founding fathers who opposed having a chaplain at all, but it was a strategic political move to bring this guy on. And I believe his name, was it Duché?
Yeah, Jacob Duché.
And I listened to the audiobook version. Is it spelled like douche, or is that just the...
It's D-U-C-H-E with an accent over the E.
Okay, well, he gets...
The only reason we know how to pronounce it is because John Adams says in one of his letters, pronounced Duché. So I've made the mistake before, and I've made it on camera. So
well, he does act kind of douchey, because he winds up flipping sides, and he winds up... he flips sides over to the redcoats, And if anything, he's like a Benedict Arnold. This guy should be seen as a traitor and a turncoat, and he was the first chaplain. And people protested having him, but they're like, you know what? It's a diplomatic move. We'll bring in, it was the Episcopalians that they were trying to show, like, oh, look, see, we're all inclusive and stuff. And then he gives this prayer, and then he turns, flips sides and says, hey, look, it's impious and improper and unchristian to rebel against the king. Yep. And it's this notion of the divine right of kings that you were talking about a second ago that he harkens back to, and that he tries to utilize in order to convince the rebels, I guess the founding fathers at the time, to abandon their cause. And yet this somehow is swept under the rug of history.
It's really interesting. I'm writing an article about this right now to hopefully be published in the coming weeks, specifically about Jacob Duché. So first, let's back up just for one second. The central point that I try to make in the founding myth is that the principles in the Bible and the Judeo-Christian principles, whatever those may be, especially those that are central to Christian nationalism, are fundamentally opposed to the principles on which the United States was built. There's this irreconcilable disconnect, so much so that the founding fathers had to divorce the two entirely, right? So the whole point I'm making in the book, the overarching point, is that there's this fundamental disconnect between Christian principles and America's founding principles. And one of getting into the Jacob Duché story, this is one of my favorite stories about American history, because you're right that it's held up all the time as, look at this great example of American piety. The founding fathers got together and prayed. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this is 1774. This is before the country has declared independence. Okay, it's before there is a constitution, a long time before there's a constitution, let alone a First Amendment to that constitution, helping to separate state and church. Okay, so this is essentially a group of English colonials getting together and saying a prayer together, right? So that's thoroughly unremarkable from that standpoint. Then the prayer was opposed by men who would go on to become the first and second Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, so not slouches when it comes to these kind of issues. Right. Yeah, and the second thing is that it almost didn't work. The proposal for prayer almost torpedoed the entire Congress, right? So having, let's see, 24, this is Sarah Vowell actually just said something like this at the FFRF convention, having 24 white Anglo-Saxon Protestants together in a room was still too diverse for them to agree on a prayer, right? It almost didn't work. And the guy they chose to appoint, Jacob Duché, was really one of the leaders of this very, what we would call conservative, loyalist sect, right? So they chose him, and John Adams says this in his journal, we were never guilty of a more masterly stroke of policy. Policy, he uses, masterly stroke of policy, not piety. They weren't doing this for religious reasons. They were doing this because of the political gain. They were using this preacher to advance their political agenda. Okay? And a little while later, the British invade Philadelphia. Jacob Duché spends one night in jail and immediately turns coat. And he does. Benedict Arnold at the time is actually fighting the battle of Fort Ticonderoga. He's an American hero at this point. And Jacob Duché writes this letter to George Washington that is just so awful and terrible and traitorous. He talks about how the Continental Congress is a bunch of basically curs and cowards and terrible men. He says that the Continental Army is the same. These are men that are giving their lives for their country and actually out there dying, and he is insulting them. I mean, imagine today a politician insulting the Continental Army. And this is the man that Christian nationalists hold up as this great person who started this unique American tradition of government prayer. And it's not just Christian nationalist historians and pseudo-historians and propagandists who are making this claim. The Supreme Court has pointed to this prayer to uphold legislative prayers before Congress, before state legislatures. This past summer, when the Supreme Court upheld the 40-foot-tall Christian cross in Bladensburg, Maryland, they pointed to Jacob Duchesne's prayers and to the fact that the founders were actually able to get together and have this prayer as a reason to leave the 40-foot-tall Christian cross on government property. Now, Justice Alito, when he was writing that, he didn't mention Jacob Duchesne's name, and he didn't mention the fact that he was a traitor. But he was, and this is just an untold story in American history that I really wanted everybody to understand and spread far and wide, that this is the guy that Christian nationalists are holding up as the progenitor of this American tradition.
Well, and a few years later, when the Founding Fathers were actually writing the Constitution, they didn't open it with a prayer.
Not only did they not open it with a prayer, they didn't have any prayers at all. And this is actually a really interesting point, because the Continental Congress in 1774, this was public meetings, right? So having a public prayer, there, because it was public, they also gained the political benefit of that prayer. But when they had the Constitutional Convention, those meetings were secret. And when they were meeting in secret, there's no political benefit to be gained from having the prayer, because it's not going to be seen by the public.
If anything, so it's divisive, because everyone is of different denominations.
Precisely. And so there's this point in the Constitutional Convention where they kind of get to this sort of standoff, this impasse. And Ben Franklin gives this little speech, and he suggests, hey, maybe we should pray. And there's a bunch of people who have weighed in on this and why would Ben Franklin suggest that of all people? But in his notes, Ben Franklin wrote the Constitutional Convention, the delegates, except for 3 or 4 people, thought prayers unnecessary, right? So they actually voted against having prayer at the Constitutional Convention. But again, if you hear the Christian nationalists tell this story, they will tell the story about this prayer proposal at the Constitutional Convention. Oh my gosh, it's so amazing. And they'll even quote some of Ben Franklin's words and then never mention that it was completely rejected by the delegates. They didn't want to have prayer. They're like, stop this, let's get back to work. Let's finish the job that we came here to do. And they didn't engage in prayer.
So did he almost toss that out as kind of almost a humorous, hey, maybe prayer will solve it type of thing? Or because he was a deist.
There are some people who think that. And it's hard to gauge the tone of it too. There's also just the idea of, Franklin was very pragmatic and very practical. I mean, when he was wandering around France as our minister during the Revolutionary War to try to win French support, he walked around in a coonskin cap and sort of these homespun clothes to play up this idea of the American frontiersman, which he was not. I mean, he's this brilliant guy. He lived in Philadelphia, cosmopolitan city. I mean, he would have probably loved nothing more than to, get dressed up the way the French did. But he played into this role because he's this pragmatic persuader. So not really clear why Franklin did that. My guess is that it was, again, not for pious reasons, but for political reasons, right? A masterly stroke of policy as opposed to piety. Again, it's really this fascinating disconnect between the stories that you hear on their side and the historical reality of the United States.
That's what I like so much about your book, is that you don't just take a quote at face value. You go through and you actually examine the underlying context, the positions of the Founding Fathers, on an individual basis, as well as the other things that they say in the context that they say them in. And there's a quote, it's a little bit of a long quote, but I really want to read it off because it struck me as there's this conversation that was going back and forth between Franklin and I'm not sure if you said in the book who it was between, but there was this idea almost that the common masses in a way needed religion in order to keep them in line. But once you reach that intellectual level, once you reach that enlightenment level, you're like, well, I can actually use my own reason to come up with my morality.
Yeah, and I think the quote you're about to read is, we actually don't know who Franklin was writing to. The best guess right now is Thomas Paine, but we're not entirely sure. Okay. But go ahead.
Yeah, he writes, you yourself may find it easy to live a virtuous life without the assistance afforded by religion. You, having a clear perception of the advantages of virtue and the disadvantages of vice, and possessing a strength of resolution sufficient to enable you to resist common temptations. But think how great a portion of mankind consists of weak and ignorant men and women, and of inexperienced, inconsiderate youth of both sexes, who have need of the motives of religion to restrain them from vice and to support their virtue, and retain them in the practice of it till it becomes habitual, which is the great point for its security. And there was this notion, I think George Washington said that, referred to the multitudes as the grazing multitude. Adams called them the common herd of mankind. Morris called them, people with no morals but their own interests. And it was almost this elitist view. Were they, in a way, kind of othering the general public from themselves as the high intellectuals who had no need of religion? Or what's going on there?
No, I mean, that is it. I mean, these views are absolutely elitist, and they were absolutely wrong. We know this. So I have a whole chapter on this, because this is probably, I don't want to call it the best Christian nationalist argument, but it is only because it's so confusing to most people, right? It's not, in and of itself, it's not actually a good or logical argument. And Bill Barr, the Attorney General, made this same argument at Notre Dame just a couple weeks ago. He quoted John Adams saying that our Constitution is made for a religious and moral people. Okay? And if you're a Christian nationalist, if you're trying to prove that our nation was founded as a Christian nation, that we're built on Judeo-Christian principles, that quote, you read that and you think, Eureka, I've got it. This is the one. Here, Andrew's wrong. But it actually, this chapter and that quote actually proves exactly what I am trying to say. I really would encourage people to pick up the book, because there's a lot of nuance here, and it's hard to recite all the nuance even in a long interview like this. But essentially, what the founders did in these quotes like this, religious and moral people, that shows that the founders thought that religion and morality were two separate things. Okay? And that is absolutely crucial. Bill Barr and the Christian nationalists are using that quote because they're saying that religion and morality are the same. So they're misunderstanding this central point that the founders were making. Basically, the founders, as the educated elite, could arrive at moral conclusions and moral behavior through reason. They had libraries, they had education, they had the time to think about these issues, whereas most people just needed simple rules so that they could do their jobs in the fields and, get back to their hovels at night and not do wrong, right? Maybe 10 rules would be a good way to get them moving. So for the masses, it's really good to have religion because they need to behave correctly. But for us, we can use morality and we can use reason to achieve that morality. Now, there's no doubt that that's what they meant. That's what they meant. They viewed religion and morality as two separate things. Okay, so if that's true, and it is, and there's plenty of support for this in the book. That means that the founders did not use religion when they were crafting the United States of America, right? Because they thought morality and reason could be achieved independently. They were going to use that to achieve good acts, not religion. So they weren't going to rely on religion in their everyday lives. They certainly weren't going to rely on it when they were crafting the founding charter of the United States of America. So those phrases, and Bill Barr spouting off at Notre Dame about that, actually proves the very point that I am trying to make, which is that the founders did not use Christian principles when they were building this nation. And the second thing to point out about all that is not only does it prove that I'm right and the Christian nationalists are wrong, it also shows one of the ways that the founding fathers were wrong. Because we now know that people do not need religion to behave well, to behave correctly, to do the right thing. And I go over in the book all the modern sociological studies and all this modern science that we have showing that the least religious countries, the least religious states do better on just about every measure of societal health and well-being that we know of. So the founding fathers were actually wrong to think that we needed a religious society to function as a democracy or a republic.
Yeah, my background is in political science and international studies, and that's 100% spot on. And there's some debate over whether or not, well, like which direction it goes. Is it when you become less religious, you become wealthier, more educated, you start to value those things more because you're giving up religion? Or is it just that as you become more wealthy and as you become more educated, you learn more, you have less of a need for religion as a crutch? And whichever direction it goes in is completely irrelevant to the point that you're making, though, because the point that you make, both here and in the book, is that you don't have to have religion to be good. And all of these instances and these case studies and these countries and statistics and everything show that you can have countries, and we do have countries that are, low crime rate, that are successful, that are well educated, that are rich, that, have low infant mortality rates, low teen pregnancy rates, low STD rates. Like, it's all of those factors that we tend to measure the well-being of a society on, all tend to go in favor of atheist countries and less religious states, and the areas of the world that are more religious tend to fare worse in those areas. So at the very least, you don't have to have religion.
I mean, and that's exactly right. And I do go out of my way at the end of the chapter, I believe, to point that out, that this doesn't show that, for instance, religion makes people immoral. It does show that the founders were wrong to say that people needed religion to behave well.
Yes. Now, at the same time, though, there is a point that you make in your book about objective morality. And you say that oftentimes Christians will claim that, how can you have morals without God, and we have an objective moral framework and stuff like that. But then you point out through how, over time, the Christian moral framework has been one of the most subjective frameworks you can possibly imagine. And even some of the same people who point out the flaws with, Bill Clinton's affairs will then look the other way when, Donald Trump has, affairs with a porn star.
We're talking about you, Franklin Graham, in case there's any doubt.
It's Billy Graham's son, by the way. Yeah. And this idea, though, you show how what the founding fathers put forth was actually fundamentally better, because you're talking about human rights versus God-given rights. Do you want to explain a little bit what the difference is between the two?
Yes, and this is it's a really crucial difference, and I do get into this. This is one of the fun conversations to have in the Declaration of Independence chapters, and it's really relevant today even. Mike Pompeo, who's our Secretary of State right now, has this Commission on Unalienable Rights in which he's re-examining the United States' commitment to human rights throughout the last 60 years, essentially going back to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and those other important international human rights documents. So the debate is relevant to now. And there's essentially kind of two competing views of human rights, right? There's God-given rights, which is the Christian nationalist view, which is what Mike Pompeo thinks about. And then there's human rights. And God-given rights are actually incredibly weak and vulnerable, right? They can be taken away by men who claim to speak for God. God-given rights are susceptible to the whim and fancy of the preacher. They also depend on where you live. Do you live in Indiana or do you live in India? They depend on the particular person's interpretation of divine will. It's the difference between Martin Luther and Martin Luther King's ideas of human rights are going to be pretty significantly different. Whereas human rights you have simply by virtue of being human. Now, you could get into some gray areas there, depending on where in time you're talking about this. People want to do it during the abortion debate too. But really, it's a much stronger, more substantive right to say you have rights simply because you are human, as opposed to you have rights that God has given you. And there's a lot of confusion about this because the Declaration of Independence talks about, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And people say, ha, God-given rights. But that's the one that Jefferson, we know he was not talking about God-given rights. He was talking about rights that are discoverable by human reason and that you possess by virtue of being human. And we know that because he wrote about that elsewhere, which I kind of explain in the book.
throughout the history of just the short history of our nation, you look at the rights of, African Americans, of women, of gay people, of trans people, and it's almost like at any time that we try to fight for human rights, it's been in the face of religious opposition. It's not, their rights are not coming from, God. Their rights are coming in spite of people's belief in God that's telling them that, gay people are an abomination, and, it's our right to own slaves, and, a woman is supposed to be, subservient to, her husband. And all of these things are contrary to Scripture. All the notion of, people are all equal, and people are all, inherently deserve the same human rights as everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, religion is a regressive force. And there's no doubt about that, and history shows that to be true. And there are instances, if you look at history, in which some religious sects have been on the side of progress, but those tend to be overblown. We know, looking at history, that it is secular individuals and secular ideals that drive progress in the right direction. The arguments against that progress are almost always religious. I mean, if you can look at some of the things you mentioned, you can look at slavery, you can look at the fight against women's rights, even something as simple as trying to get divorced in the United States. I mean, throughout history, religion has been on the wrong side of those arguments. And again, it's not to say that some sects weren't on the right side. For instance, of the abolition movement, the Quakers in particular, but it's a minor influence. What you nearly always see happening is secular ideas and secular individuals driving religion to liberalize and driving liberal sects into progressive positions. And this is counterintuitive to a lot of people, even a lot of secular Americans. And it's counterintuitive. Professor Mark Smith likened it to the tail wagging the dog, right? But it's only counterintuitive because religion later comes along and rewrites history. And you can see this happening time and time again. I mean, in the lead up to the Civil War, the arguments for slavery were biblical. They were almost exclusively religious. But to hear it told nowadays, well, the abolitionists were Christians driven by piety. And that's true to a point. But those Christians were driven to that position by other secular abolitionists and secular movements. And there's a lot of, I really go over this a lot in the book, and I try to draw this out, and I reference a few other very good books. Again, that book by Professor Mark Smith. But religion excels at taking credit for work that it has not achieved. And this is also a common theme in the founding myth. I had a debate on C-SPAN about the founding of the United States of America and whether or not we were based on Judeo-Christian principles. And I asked my opponent, this guy named Mark David Hall, name one Judeo-Christian principle on which the United States was built. And he can't. But what he likes to do is to claim universal human principles for his religion. And that's what you see happening throughout history. They claim these victories for humanity in the name of Christianity. And if you want to see a good example of it, you can actually see it happening today. You can already see this happening with marriage equality. So the opposition, as I'm sure everybody remembers, to marriage equality was exclusively religious and Christian nationalist for the most part, right? But it happened. The Supreme Court correctly decided it, though it's up in the air whether or not that will stay there. John Roberts, well, I won't get into that. However, you can see some religions now, some of the more liberal sects, saying, look, we were the primary driver of marriage equality. And it's simply not true. And I bet you in 20 to 40 years, maybe even less because of, we're in the information age now, religion is going to be claiming full credit for marriage equality. I bet. We'll lay a lot of money on that.
You know what this reminds me of is when you see imams that are saying that Islam is the most feminist religion and cares the most about, gender equality. And all it takes is just the most precursory knowledge of, and I lived in the Muslim world for 15 years, but you don't even have to do that. All you have to do is have Google and that's horseshit. But this idea too, you were talking about, slavery being argued for, on a biblical standpoint. But it's not just that. It's also scientific progress. We've seen that with Bush blocking stem cell research on biblical grounds, but this goes all the way back to the founding fathers fighting against it. And there's an amazing story in your book. I want you to talk about it a little bit, but with Franklin and lightning rods. Do you want to get into that? And I don't want to give too much of your book away because I want people to go out and buy it, but this is a great story that people should hear.
Yeah, Franklin snatched the scepter from kings and lightning from the gods. Franklin invented the lightning rod, and it was opposed by preachers at the time. It used to be that the way they would ward off lightning was sprinkling water from the River Jordan on the bells in their bell towers, and that would supposedly ward off lightning. Shock of shocks, it didn't work, and you'd have these bell ringers in the church getting zapped all the time, tons of people dying, fires, and then Franklin comes along and invents his steel points, his lightning rods, and problem solved. And it was opposed at the time because this was thwarting God's will. And it's amazing to see the lengths that religionists will go to oppose progress in the name of their God. And there was a big, huge earthquake at the time that made what we'd call international news now, and they blamed it on Franklin and his lightning rods. They thought that the lightning was going into the earth and that it was building up this charge, and that's what caused the earthquake. You see it throughout history. Those opposing inoculations and vaccines back then, which still unfortunately have happening now. And I go over a lot of this in the book because science is really one of America's founding principles. They talk about science in the Constitution itself. The founders referred to the Constitution and to the country as the American experiment, right? They really believed they were putting these ideas of political science that were born in the Enlightenment to the test. They were literally testing them in the American experiment. This was a country that was built on science, not faith. And I have a whole chapter going over those different ones. And I also love the Franklin story. It is one of my favorite. Franklin was just such an interesting character too. Yeah.
And they're like, how dare he? I think the quote was robbing the Almighty of his thunder.
Yeah. Well, it's just amazing. It's amazing that they believe this God to be all powerful too. And, something like an iron rod with a wire attached to it can thwart his will. A thin little piece of latex can thwart God's will.
God's will of giving someone AIDS.
Yeah. Or
it's impregnating it.
It's unbelievable how weak their God is when you actually come right down to it.
Yeah.
It's almost like he's there.
Now, Baruch Spinoza was a major influence on the founding fathers, correct? And he had this notion of God is more just order in the cosmos. It's kind of a deistic God, but it's almost more pantheistic. It's kind of God is everything. God is nature. God is the mathematical equations. God is 2 + 2 = 4. And this is referred to by the founding fathers as nature's God.
Nature.
God just it is nature. Nature is all that there is. There is no interacting, supernatural force. And this was famous with, I believe it was Jefferson that cut out all of the supernatural miracles from the Bible, from the story of Jesus, and it was Jefferson's Bible.
Yeah, Jefferson actually took this. This is the guy that they're saying is, this devout Christian. He actually took a razor to the Bible. And he didn't actually cut out the supernatural parts instead, because that would have been too much. Instead, he cut out the parts that were not supernatural and cut and pasted them into a different book. Things like the virgin birth were excised, the resurrection was excised from it. And he said that this chore was like pulling diamonds from a dunghill, right? So imagine a president today saying that the Bible was basically a dunghill. Imagine the reaction that would get. But this is our third president. This is a guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence. And nature's God really is, the laws of nature and of nature's God is right there in the Declaration of Independence. And this is the one phrase that Jefferson, of those four, that Jefferson included in the original. And we know what Jefferson meant when he was talking about nature's God. He was talking about natural law. And he was not talking about supernatural law, just about natural law kind of as descriptive. And I go over this at great length, kind of explaining where this came from. So it really is interesting. As far as Spinoza goes, it's hard to pinpoint a direct line from Spinoza to any of the founders, but Spinoza was just this massive influence on the thinkers that then in turn influenced the founders. But it's really interesting. And the book that I would point to for people who are more interested in that is Matthew Stewart wrote a book called Nature's God, The Heretical Origins of the American Revolution, I believe is what the subtitle. But Nature's God by Matthew Stewart is a really great read on this and informed a lot of my book. He was also kind enough to blurb the founding myths, so it was awfully nice of him.
Now, there's so much more in your book that, obviously I'm not going to cover all of it. People need to go out there and buy the book, read it, check it out. You talk about, more about, some of the founding documents. You talk about, the 10 Commandments and compare that to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and whatnot. You compare, there's so much more in there. There's so much meat. You were very, very thorough. This was what, an 8-year project for you?
Pretty much about 8 years, yeah.
And you're a lawyer, so the legal background.
I do. I'm a First Amendment attorney. I do this stuff for a living. So it was really, it was also a labor of love. But the 10 Commandments, part 3 of the book is the 10 Commandments versus the Constitution. And I walk the reader through every one of the 10 Commandments to see how they stack up against our founding principles. And it turns out that every single one, everyone, even the ones that your listeners are thinking, yeah, well, what about that one? Because there's a lot of overlap with that one in American law. Yeah, that one too. All of them are fundamentally opposed to the principles on which our nation was built, which I didn't expect to find when I initially launched this. And that part, the 10 Commandments part, is actually where the book started. This was I was going to write a law review article on the 10 Commandments that got really out of hand really fast and ended up becoming this book, years later. But it really is, a lot of work went into it. And no matter how well versed you are, in this area, you will learn something, and you will learn certainly new arguments to push back against Christian nationalism.
Now, which 10 Commandments do you break down? Because there's multiple versions in the Old Testament, including the one that includes, thou shalt not boil a goat in its mother's milk, and all the important stuff.
Yeah, which is the first one that's called the 10 Commandments. So I do have a whole chapter called Which 10. That's what kicks off the 10 Commandments. And I did the Exodus 20 set, even though that's not technically referred to as the 10 Commandments. But
it's the one that everyone tends to, jump on.
It's the one that everybody thinks of as the 10 Commandments. There's 4 sets in any given Bible. But then different religions also interpret them differently. They number them differently. And, one of the points that I try to make is that even these seemingly small differences are actually huge, because there's no such thing as a small religious difference, right? So you have one sect saying you can't make graven images, and another saying you can't make idols. Well, I don't know what the difference is between that, and frankly, I don't care. It's completely irrelevant. I'm going to do what I want, and we have, thankfully, the First Amendment in this country, so we're protected with free expression, free speech. We can make idols and graven images. But the difference in that translation split Christendom. It's caused a civil war in the 8th and 9th centuries. The Holy Roman Empire went to war with itself over this discrepancy. The difference between not being able to kill and not being able to murder is the difference between being able to defend yourself if somebody breaks into your house at night and wants to hurt you and your family, right? In one, you can defend yourself, and the other, you can't. So there's no such thing as a small religious difference.
So what's on the calendar for you coming up? Is there a massive book tour that you're doing? Are you any major media appearances? Are you working on another book?
I've been on a book tour. I'm taking a little bit of time off. We got to fight the war on Christmas in November and December. It gets earlier every year. So I gotta be home in the trenches for that. Then kicking off next year, I am doing some more book stops. I've got Iowa. I'm going there just before the caucuses. I'm planning a Pennsylvania tour. I'll be at the American Atheist Convention over Easter weekend as usual, which I think is in Arizona this year. I'll be in Southern California at some point. So if anybody wants to look for those dates, I'm at Andrew L. Seidel, Seidel, on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and I'll post as those dates come in.
You know that Sean Hannity and Fox News are going to have a field day when you say that you're waging a war on Christmas, right?
I mean, I do it every year, and we didn't talk about this, but Fox News actually covered the founding myth without mentioning it or me. So they posted a headline from an interview that I did with Salon. And they posted that headline without the subheading, which said Andrew L. Seidel talks about his new book or something like that. And they had a whole panel of these religious guys on, including Robert Jeffress, Ravi Zacharias, and then what's his name? The Catholic priest who appears on Fox, Father John something or another.
So they straight up edited out part of the subheading.
Yeah, and then they didn't mention my name, but they actually tried to walk through and refute each of the points that I try to make in the book.
But didn't have you on.
But didn't have me on to talk about it. Really, really underhanded and interesting. I did a Twitter thread on it that kind of caught fire. Got retweeted by a bunch of different people, like Kevin Cruz, the resident Twitter historian, and a few others, because it was just this really bizarre experience of seeing Fox News talking about you and your book and not mentioning that it's you or your book by name. It was really, really weird. I only knew about it because one of FFRF's media people saw it and they were like, Andrew, they're definitely talking about your book. Like, that headline is from the interview you did. Like, I don't know if I would have even connected. I certainly would have seen it if that person hadn't sent it to me. So thanks, Lauren.
Wow. So
yeah, super bizarre.
What about with FFRF? Are you guys have any, aside from the war on Christmas, how are things going there? You guys just had your convention.
We just had our convention. It was phenomenal. Sarah Vowell was here, Trey Crowder, the liberal redneck, Jeff Charlotte from The Family was here. We had 2 sitting U.S. representatives give talks, Jamie Raskin, who's on the Judiciary Committee, and Mark Pocan, they both received awards. We had Mandisa Thomas. It was one of the best conventions I've been to in a long time. It was really just chock-a-block full of great speakers. We had a couple student awardees who blew the doors off the place. This guy who wrote this book called The Founding Myth gave a little talk. He was all right. Tony Pinn gave a great talk. Amber Scora, who wrote Leaving the Witness, about leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses and about dealing with the loss of your child, the grief that stems from that without religion, gave an amazing talk. It was really...
I think I saw she just gave a TEDx talk not too long ago.
She did. I highly recommend it. Her story was really interesting. And FFRF already has all those videos, for the most part, up online, so people can go see them. Our next convention is going to be in San Antonio, and it's like, if you're an FFRF member, it's like $60 to come to our conventions. It's pretty damn cheap, and it's only $40 to be an FFRF member. So it's a great place to see some big names and some really fascinating thinkers.
Well, I live in Austin, so the San Antonio thing definitely makes it easy.
Better see you there. But beyond that, we're still we get between 3,000 and 4,000 state church complaints every single year. We are battling Christian nationalism on every front, still taking these fights in the courts, still winning them in the courts despite the changing federal judiciary. We are out there fighting for you, for secular Americans. We kind of began the talk, you mentioned, in my book, I'm not trying to say we should outlaw Christianity or anything close to that. And one of the things I've been trying to tell people today and every day is that there is no such thing as the freedom of religion without a government that is free from religion, right? All these people claiming today, like, we need religious liberty, we need religious freedom, that's true, but the best way to ensure that is to ensure that the wall of separation between state and church is high and impregnable, right? A secular government is the only true guarantee for religious liberty, and that happens to be what FFRF is fighting for.
Yeah, neutrality.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew, is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to touch on still?
I would really encourage people to go buy the book, even if you think you know this stuff. We need better arguments in this arena, and I am a lawyer who argues these issues for a living. I spent 8 years honing these arguments. We hear them every single day from teachers and principals and mayors who think that they can violate the rights of conscience of other citizens because the United States was founded as a Christian nation. So I promise you're going to learn something from the founding myth, and would really encourage people to go pick up a copy, and more importantly than that, join FFRF, because right now we need all the help and membership that we can get.
Fantastic. Guys, go check out his book. Make sure that you purchase a copy, The Founding Myth by Andrew Seidel, and go become a member of FFRF as well.
Well, I should say too, if people want a signed copy of the book, I'm here in Free Thought Hall, the headquarters of FFRF, and FFRF sells the book. So if you check out at the FFRF store, there's a little place you can leave a note, say, I want Andrew to sign this, and I'll sign it before we put it in the mail. So you pay a little more for that, but as opposed to Amazon. But I also donate all the money from those sales back to FFRF. So you're double bonus kind of thing.
That's a very good deal. So, Andrew, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
And if you're so kind as to want to support my work promoting scientific skepticism and critical thinking, you can make a one-time donation on PayPal or place an ongoing pledge on patreon.com/holykoolaid. And if you like this shirt that I'm wearing, you can get yours via my merch store. Links to everything are in the description below. And last but not least, thank you so much to all my current patrons and donors. You guys are amazing. You freaking rock. And as always, dare to be curious, but don't drink the Kool-Aid.